David Donati, Senior Attorney for the ACLU of Texas. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
So, the ACLU of Texas has said it will file a legal challenge, it will file a lawsuit against the state of Texas once Governor Abbott signs Senate Bill 4 from this fourth special session we're in right now. Why is this so important?
We've already seen the consequences of the state of Texas's multi-billion-dollar anti-immigrant enforcement program. Those consequences range from the actual death of human beings, of migrants who are seeking asylum and protection in the United States, to the loss of freedom and opportunity in our border communities and in the interior of our state. We've seen concertina wire in the Rio Grande, which is a river that's been a home to human beings for thousands of years. So we have seen rampant civil rights abuses under this program. And with these new laws, we fully anticipate that these consequences are going to increase by an order of magnitude. The head of the Department of Public Safety estimated that anywhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people will be arrested each year under these new state laws. That is a tenfold increase over the number of immigrants who are already currently arrested under Operation Lone Star, which is far greater than should be arrested under normal state law principles. And so we anticipate that the scale of egregious human and civil rights abuses is going to increase in a way that we haven't seen as a country since our founding.
And I wanted to ask you because historically, the federal government has had jurisdiction over the issue of immigration. So, how confident are you that once a legal challenge, you file a legal challenge, that your organization will win in court?
It's not only a historical matter, it's just a fundamental principle of sovereignty, of the order of nations, of international law, that when we have something called a country, they speak with one voice with regard to immigration, migration, who belongs, who can be deported at all, and how we govern our foreign affairs. So this is a power that by the very structure and nature of the United States sovereignty belongs with the federal government. There is no question, and the Supreme Court has confirmed this for over 150 years since immigration controls existed in this country, that the federal government speaks with one voice, that states cannot interfere with that federal prerogative. So we are very confident, and we are very confident that this law violates those core constitutional principles and cannot stand.
Republicans have said they passed these laws because the Biden administration is not doing enough to keep people from crossing into Texas, and so they feel obligated to do this. Um, what do you make of that?
I think that argument has been tried and failed. California was making similar arguments in the 1880s with regard to Chinese immigrants who were helping to build our railroads. And so every time this issue has been presented, there have always been conflicts between state and federal governments as to the appropriate degree of immigration controls and restrictions, whether the federal government is being decisive or strict enough, and those have always been struck down. I also think beyond the legal question, Texas is presenting misinformation. The Biden administration is being extremely harsh against migrants. We at the ACLU are no fans of the Biden administration's asylum policies or immigration policies. And nonetheless, we believe that it is fundamental that those immigration enforcement prerogatives remain with the federal government.
How has the Biden administration's policies been harsh? What are they doing that's harsh?
In a number of ways. I think it took too long for the Biden administration to roll back Trump administration policies like Title 42, which was an abuse of public health powers to exclude the right to asylum categorically. That was also not merely the fault of the Biden administration. States like Texas interfered with the administration's ability to roll back that program. But the Biden administration also has sharply limited the ability of people to come and petition for asylum into the United States. So we have active litigation against the Biden administration for its own asylum transit ban, which prohibited people from petitioning for asylum if they crossed through a country, for example, Mexico, without seeking asylum. It was our view that that is a violation of our international law obligations to accept petitions for asylum, and we sued the Biden administration in court and have active litigation about that policy.
And so, what is the solution? I mean, people on both sides of the political aisle have described what's going on at the southern border a crisis. So, what is your solution to what we are seeing and the numbers of people who are coming into Texas and the United States?
Yeah, and it's a fair question. I think all of us are struggling with that question of what a solution is. I think that question begins with identifying what the problem is. And so, is migration a problem? We all have different views about that. I do think human beings have been migrating since the dawn of our species. And so, migration in and of itself is not a problem. The numbers of migrants that we have at this moment are high, but they're certainly not unprecedented in the history of our country, and certainly not as a proportion of the number of Americans that we have in this moment. And even if we accept uh, the principle, which I think is a correct one, that migration should be regularized, that it should be legal, and that we should know who is able to come into our country, for example, to keep criminals out of our country. I don't think that we've taken the steps to make that happen. And so there are a number of common sense solutions that have been proposed and considered over the decades. But fundamentally, what this case is not about what the precise solution is, it's about where that solution lies. And so, one question we have to be asking ourselves is why has there been no federal immigration reform since the 1980s, since Reagan granted amnesty? And that's a really difficult and challenging question because we now have people who have lived in the United States for 30 years who cannot regularize their status. There is no legal pathway for them to become lawful citizens of the United States, and they live in constant fear that a traffic stop is going to lead to their expulsion. So there needs to be federal immigration reform, but that's precisely the point that these issues are hard and that there is a forum to litigate those issues, and that is the United States Congress. The problem becomes when every state or local government takes the issue into their own hands and says, we have the solution. And that's what Texas is doing in this moment. They're saying, we can do this better than the federal government. Our Texas elected representatives in the House of Representatives and Senate, they can go to the president and they can say, we need a solution. Texas has not done that. We are not hearing solutions from Texas. What we are hearing is a doubling down on failed policies. The federal government has had illegal entry and reentry crimes for a century. And for most of the past 2 decades, federal immigration prosecutions have been a majority of federal prosecutions. And I have not seen an ounce of data that shows that that in any way deters or inhibits unlawful migration. What it does do is it fuels our crisis of mass incarceration. It provides a lot of money to private prisons and other contractors, but it also adds consequences to people who understand the risks of migration and they do it anyway. And so we need to ask, why are people migrating? And why are people subjecting themselves to so much danger, not just here at our southern border, but before they get here when they're crossing? Why are we seeing the United Nations calling the southern border of the United States the deadliest land crossing in the world? And so if the idea is that adding criminal prosecution in the state of Texas is going to deter people from trying to survive, to provide for their families, we have seen decades of failed experiments with using the criminal justice system to address migration. And my fear is that this problem of migration is only going to get worse because people are not able to live where they are. And so we need to be collectively organizing solutions rather than punishing the individual migrants who, for very, very many valid reasons that they wish to present to federal immigration officers, need to request asylum from the United States. Whether the US grants their asylum petitions or not is a separate question. But the fundamental issue is that the United States is the one that should be deciding.
What are some of the common sense solutions that you said have been proposed that are not getting anywhere?
Well, we should have regular pathways to citizenship, including for people who entered without inspection many years ago. So it is to me unacceptable that we have people who have lived in the United States for 30 years, who have paid taxes, who have never committed a crime and have a spotless criminal record, and they continue to live in fear and can be deported tomorrow. That to me is unacceptable and inhumane. So there need to be lawful pathways for citizenship that do not exist at this moment. We need to increase our capacity to process people at ports of entry so that we don't have people in encampments in places like northern Mexican states, where we have seen so many kidnappings, assaults, violence, extortion. It is tremendously dangerous to try and cross into the United States. And the reason that people are forced to remain in those dangerous environments is because we don't have adequate capacity to process people in a lawful way. People say, well, you should just come legally. What we need to be doing is spending some of the many billions of dollars that we spend every year as a federal government and as a state government to figure out how we can increase our capacity to process, to analyze people's claims, and to enable people to come if they have valid reasons to be here. And there are so many reasons that we can disagree ideologically about whether being with a family member is sufficient, whether it should be work related, whether it should be economic related, whether you have to be the victim of a crime or war. But there is a forum for us to litigate these, and that is the United States Congress. That is in the federal government, and a we cannot be a country where all 50 states have their own immigration policies.
My last question to you, and I appreciate your time very much, is as far as how you look at some of the cities, you look at our border communities here in Texas, you look at the impact of what's going on in New York City and Chicago and some of the other big cities, and people are not happy about what's going on with all of the migrants, impacting the various communities. And so I'm wondering, what is the answer to that?
Well, I do think that a lot of the crisis and confusion is self-inflicted. And so if you have states like Texas that are sending buses of people to New York City without warning, without telling them, hey, we're going to be sending these people, here's who they are, that creates part of this sensation of crush and a lack of access to resources. So this is a logistical problem, to be sure, but it's one that the state of Texas and other states are contributing to intentionally to magnify the illusion of crisis. If we were to address this problem in the way that we address any other problem, then we could actually make it a whole lot easier for ourselves. We could figure out what are people's needs, where do they want to go, and identify what are the capacity to receive people in particular places. So there are a lot of common sense solutions. But I do think that the crush that cities like New York City experience at the moment are exacerbated or made worse by the fractured immigration policies of the state of Texas and the state of Florida and other places who are taking it upon themselves to say, we're going to show you this is a problem, we're going to make this a political issue, rather than coming forward and saying, it's our intention to help solve this collectively as a country. And if we were approaching it in that way, I have no doubt that we as a country have the capacity and the resources to process and humanely treat every single person who is coming to our southern border and asking for refuge or asylum. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. And any economist that you ask about the consequences of migration will tell you the same thing. Yes, immigration is actually a net positive to a country's viability. And I have views about that. Economists have views about that. And I vote in elections. I vote in federal elections. And that's what should be happening in this moment. And so the question is not, uh, is immigration good? Is immigration bad? How should we deal with it? The question is, where do those decisions lie? Who gets to be the decision maker? And as a principle, a fundamental principle of sovereignty and US constitutional law, the answer to that is the United States federal government.
I did have one follow-up on that. I mean, aren't there more migrants in New York City than many more than what the state of Texas has sent?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that that is also a function of New York City having traditionally been a city of immigrants, of people trying to unify with their families, and also people's perception of where they're going to be welcomed. And so New York City has had to deal with this problem. They have a right of housing, for example, which has guaranteed that every person is entitled to shelter. And the New York City mayor has objected to that. And so I want to be very sympathetic to the problems that particular jurisdictions are experiencing. And I want to collectively contribute to the solutions to those problems. But I don't think that Texas criminalizing migration, Texas creating an entirely separate criminal legal system to process 75,000 people per year, preventing them from even going to the federal government and saying, I have a valid claim to remain in the United States, that's not going to address New York City's problem. What that is going to do is that's going to create a number of problems in Texas. It's going to create a number of human problems for migrants and residents of border communities without in any way addressing whether New York City has adequate housing for people or support for people. There are a lot of solutions that we could talk about. We could talk about work permits for asylum seekers, which can take 18 months, for example. So you have people in New York City shelters who aren't able to work and pay for apartments for themselves, so they have to rely on public housing. That is a federal immigration law issue that demands federal immigration law reform. But what Texas has done here doesn't address that problem. It just makes a lot of different problems worse.
David Donati, Senior Staff Attorney at the ACLU of Texas. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Thanks so much, Jack. Have a great day.